afternoon. So this next segment of the conference has a slightly different format than the panels that we've had thus far. It's a performance lecture by Sarah Knaus, which will be followed by a response by Stephanie Jemison, and I'll introduce each of them. The idea, so it's a single solo performance, and then we thought it would be nice to have another artist to follow up with some questions and commentary to kind of open discussion. So Sarah Knaus is an interdisciplinary artist and critical writer examining the politics of landscape and public space. Her research-based creative projects trace the production of landscape through ecological, historical, and legal forces, with particular interest given to the environmental and cultural effects of military activities. She's currently associate professor in the Department of Art and Design at Northeastern University, where she directs the MFA program in interdisciplinary arts and coordinates the Studio Arts MFA program, offered in collaboration with the School of the Museum of Fine Arts. She's also held faculty positions in the University of Iowa's Intermedia program and in the Department of Cinema and Photography at Southern Illinois University. She earned her MFA degree in studio art from the University of Illinois and a BA in art from Yale University. And then Stephanie Jemison, who will be responding, is currently the Arthur Levitt Jr. Class of '52 Artist in Residence and a faculty member at Williams College. She received a BA from Columbia University and an MFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, so another Chicago connection. And she's currently teaching a course here at Williams entitled Landscape and Language, so we thought she would be a great person to have respond to Sarah's performance. She also has a show currently on at Mass MoCA entitled Plant You Now, Dig You Later. And Mass MoCA opens at 11 o'clock tomorrow for those of you who either are here or will still be around, but especially for speakers who may be leaving, there might be an opportunity to see the show. Maybe also tonight, although it may conflict with dinner, so it might be difficult, but I was excited to learn about it. And so with that, I give you Sarah's performance.
My grandfather would have been 99 the year my daughter was born. They share a long century, but just barely. She, born 9 years after its not yet apocalyptic end, he, born 10 years into it. Poised on opposite shores of that oceanic expanse we call the 20th century, they will never see each other's faces, but mere images, they are all the same. My grandfather was born during what textbooks call the Second Industrial Revolution, that period of rapid change in technology, transportation, energy, agriculture, from the end of the American Civil War until the outbreak of World War II. My grandfather loved electricity. His passion for the intricacies of energy, generating it, transmitting it, using it, may have exceeded all other passions in his life. Having missed the great discoveries, he focused on their implementation. He began working for the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power just after the end of the water wars, when ranchers and farmers tried to sabotage the aqueduct that killed the Owens Valley and ensured the city's growth. With long-distance water secure for a time, the department turned to long-distance power. My grandfather specialized in transmission, the art of moving enormous quantities of electricity across vast desert distances. He began in the testing labs and worked his way up. Over decades, the spider vein network of lines he designed, planned, tested, and supervised fueled an ever more voracious Southern California lifestyle. Radios in the 20s and 30s, TVs in the 40s, air conditioners in the 50s, all electric kitchens in the 60s, jacuzzi tubs and heated pools in the 70s. By the time he became general manager in 1968, the department had to remind its sticker-shocked customers, it's not just a light bill anymore. It's not just a light bill anymore. Like long-distance water, long-distance power insulated human senses from the extremities of desert life. LA's development jumped coastal mountains and flooded into the hot inland valleys where I grew up. Between my grandfather's birth and my daughter's, LA's population grew 12-fold. Between my grandfather's birth and my daughter's, the Earth got hotter by almost 1 degree. It's not just a light bill anymore. It's not just a light bill anymore. When do you notice electricity? When do you see it, hear it, smell it? Do you feel it coursing through your body? And is it a pulsing or a warmth? Do you see it whipping through the wild in light, bright bolts, or hear its domesticated buzzing in the walls of your bedroom? Do you take it for granted, forgetting all it's done, the way it's helped you build body and mind? Do you notice it most when it's gone? Sometime in my teens, my grandfather rallied from his long but not slow decline. I already identified as an artist, and somehow that stuck with him when little else could anymore. During one of the visits that terrified me to contemplate, he said he had something important to show me. Slowly turning, he retrieved a box beside the club chair where he spent his days. He fumbled the lid open and exhaled deeply at the sight of the contents. A stack of 8 by 10-inch photographs came out, each one depicting a single high-voltage transmission tower in sharp black and white. He had taken them all and proudly walked me through each image. The details of the design decision seemed hazy to him, or else I can't remember what I didn't understand to begin with. What struck me was his sense of the object's aesthetic force. "This one is just so beautiful," he would tell me. I smiled, indulging an old man his moment, and tried to see the beauty in the images that he did. A few years later, I sat in an art history class partially paid for by his estate. In a lecture on Caspar David Friedrich, I remembered my grandfather. I recognized his response to those transmission towers as a variant on the sublime, directed not at nature, but a feat of human engineering. My grandfather experienced them not just as aesthetic objects, but as local manifestations of the almost unimaginably vast system of electrical transmission. For him, there was nothing mundane about electricity. Along with most adults in the 1930s, he'd known a world where electricity was not yet part of daily life, not quite new, but like the internet for my generation, electricity brought radical change in the organization of work, recreation, and home. Urban legend holds that people danced in the midnight bright streets of Los Angeles when the current began flowing through lines my grandfather tested, all the way from Hoover Dam, 266 miles. The classical sublime humbled the viewer before nature, but the technological sublime celebrated humanity's capacity to overcome it, or so we thought. Modern aesthetics of acceleration, machinery, and scale made more intense and frequent experiences of the technological sublime. In the United States, where industrialization occurred alongside and promoted territorial expansion, engineering feats joined landscape features as symbols of a specifically national wonder. It is difficult to overestimate the impact of electricity on the experience of the city. Transforming night into day at the flip of a switch, artificial light delivered once dark hours for labor, consumption, and family life. Seasonal and geographic patterns of daylight no longer governed the rhythms of human activities which industrialization had already accelerated. Electricity annihilated time just as time had already annihilated space. In this way, it made us modern. Electricity also carried an affective and aesthetic force beyond its utility. This excess of meaning registered in turn-of-the-century slang we still use today. Energetic people are called live wires or dynamos after the first industrial generators. To feel electric means to be socially or sexually aroused. Many of the first public displays of electric lighting were installed as much for pleasure, consumption, and spectacle as for utility. World's fairs delivered fantastic lightscapes that inspired illuminated thoroughfares and entertainment zones in cities across the country. Patterns of mobility quickly reoriented around zones of street lighting and the automobile. Electric signage soon followed, commodifying the newly accessible evening public spaces with advertising and promoting some of the most iconic and nostalgia-drenched images of 20th century petro-modernity. Infrastructures enable, shape, and constrain life at any given historical moment. They are relational and not immanent. We make them, and they make us. Alan Liu has argued that over the course of a century in which American lives unfolded in organizational formations of ever greater intricacy and reach, the experience of infrastructure has become operationally the experience of culture itself. He claims that near-future theorists with Raymond Williams scale ambition must attend to infrastructure as that cyborg being whose making, working, disciplining, performance, gender formation, and hybridity are increasingly part of the core identity of late modern culture. Deborah Cowan notes that infrastructures are systems engineered to order social and natural worlds. For that reason, they occupy a central position within a wide range of contemporary political conflicts, from port and road occupations to the Flint water crisis to pipeline construction on sovereign indigenous lands. The political nature of infrastructure is also personal for Ruth Wilson Gilmore and Clayton Rosati, who describe an infrastructure of feeling in which technology, matter, and space form the tangible material conditions within which our social emotions are lived, felt, and communicated. For Lauren Berlant, infrastructure is the living mediation of what organizes life, the life world of structure. So this talk is an invitation to both feel and think with infrastructure. It is about conflicting notions of the future, uncertain filiations, and different ways of assembling the past. It is reparative, but it is also critical. In it, I hope to queer the environmental history of my family, even at the moment of its first and fragmentary writing. By queer, I mean to establish another horizons of possibility for my familiar family tree, other than the linear progression of generational begats, a straight time that leads inexorably to the present, my daughter, and a 408 part per million world. By queer, I mean to compose a set of improper family relations arrayed against, maybe residing inside, what we presume to know. So, Jose Esteban Munoz writes that to live inside straight time and ask for a desire and imagine another time and place is to represent and perform a desire that is both utopian and queer. To perform this desire is to move in ecstatic time, a temporary space, a place outside oneself where utopian horizons of possibility can be glimpsed and approached. Ecstatic time is signaled at the moment one feels ecstasy, announced perhaps in a scream or grunt of pleasure, he writes. Perhaps too, I would add, in other sense overwhelming experiences like childbirth or holding hands with the dying. Yet also, and more importantly, he continues, during moments of contemplation when one looks back at a scene from one's past, present, or future. I sometimes contemplate just such a scene. It is a secondhand memory, borrowed from the only photograph I found with just my grandfather and me inside the frame. I am 3 years old. I am bringing him a gift. He is not looking at me. From Lauren Berlant. What if we derived our social theory from scenes of ambivalence, which is to say, the scenes of attachment that are intimate, defined by desire, and overwhelming? What I know is that my grandfather gestated transmission lines brought forth miles of cable and nursed power plants into being. Like most parents, he had no idea what he had birthed and who he was leaving behind. He made the desert buzz. In this queer infrastructural genealogy, I am kin not just to my human cousins or even other critters, but also with the Victorville switching station, the Sylmar converter station, the Pacific DC intertie, the Hoover Dam, My tools for assembling these relations are clumsy and my research skills imprecise. I ask you to remain open to that which outpaces understanding. My grandfather was born in a bungalow in Amarillo, Texas, the only son of a railroad worker and an ambitious woman who wanted more. Her husband turned down promotions that would have taken him from overalls in the yard to suits in the office. She wanted the suit for her son. She relates that he had an early aptitude for engineering found in erector sets of great complexity and a love of crossing wires to watch sparks. It's just so beautiful, he would tell her. By 1929, he was already a student at the University of Oklahoma. In 1932, he had moved west to California not as a Dust Bowl refugee, but a Caltech graduate student, trailed by thousands fleeing ecological collapse and impoverishment back home. His mother's letters, mere daily letters, continued the education and moral development she had done for him since birth. She told him to develop a taste for finer things and schooled him in the arts of professional diplomacy. Outperforming one entry-level job led him to a promotion, then another, and then a Stanford scholarship. For the rest of his career, his colleagues called him Doc. Reborn from Stanford, he possessed a credential as much as a name. There are few candid photos of his early years, but I like to imagine him anyway, before the top floor office and the moods. I imagine him in the desert, his body dwarfed by transmission towers, working in the crisp dawn air of the Mojave, maybe sleeping in canvas tents at night. The Hoover Dam had just been completed, but the transmission lines were losing power as they crossed through the desert. The conditions were rugged, frontier, like the science. This is how he said he got his PhD. Early engineering is far too easy to romanticize. The logbooks were written in pencil, instruments protected by wood and metal. The work seems dangerous, heroic, full of arcs and sparks. A period before computer models and digital sensors, when tools enhanced the body's own senses and the data were sorted by the mind. A time when places named as racial slurs show up, unremarkable in a dissertation, when a woman, more than one, stood behind every great man. In truth, he went back and forth between Palo Alto, LA, and the desert, and delegated at least some of this labor to others. Line tests conducted by other men, reports hand-copied by stenos. He often wasn't happy at Stanford and found his courses less interesting than what he'd been doing on the job, though the applied nature of his research meant he never really stopped working. His mother's letters worry about his weight and his sleep. She sends him small amounts of money more times than I can count. She gives him a car. She implores him not to drop out. We need to bend the ecological stories we tell ourselves, the one where masculine masters subdue feminized nature, dam rivers into lakes for hydropower, and level mountains to claw out coal. We need to twist them around and take a look outside the frame. Those masculine masters have bodies too, and we can't let them forget it. They get sunburns and chest colds, run out of socks, sign up for meal plans. How could the lab be a space of disembodied knowledge when we know there is no such thing? I am told my grandfather was a small man in his top floor office, in his executive chair. His feet couldn't quite touch the ground. My grandmother, Betty, is part of this story too. Her family's ties to LA go back far enough that people, non-native people, are impressed. My grandmother's grandparents came to Southern California from the Midwest. They became merchants and progressives, educators, socialists, the kind of people like me like finding on our family tree, as if we had anything to do with it. When times were tough, they would send their daughters to college and not their sons. My great-grandmother attended UC Berkeley. Grandma Betty went to USC. She was spunky enough to take a job that required a driver's license without ever having sat behind the wheel of a car. She learned to drive in a weekend. By the time I knew her, this spark had long since turned to ash. My grandfather's religion, conservative, Protestant, became hers when they married in 1938. She gave up her career and submitted to her husband as head of the family, her new faith fervent and lifelong. Apparently, the secular moral codes of service and temperance espoused by her socialist parents translated well to Presbyterianism and parenting. Their early letters are effusive and breathless. She alludes to moments of intimacy that she wouldn't describe or relate to her girlfriends. Over time, his early affections give way to criticism. He upbraids her for minor housekeeping lapses and then turns around to shower praise on his secretary. At one point in time, when my father was in college, she thought of leaving him and did not. When I was young, it was she I loved with intensity and he with a measured sense of duty. In photographs taken by others, he often stands alone. In this photograph he took of my grandmother, she is on a Southern California beach. It looks like afternoon. At 39, she is younger than I am now. She seems to have no intention to swim. Her posture hovers between relaxation and vigilance. Her two sons, my father 9, my uncle 5, likely just outside the frame. Also just outside the frame, the H-bomb, which would soon vaporize an island and create a fireball 3 miles wide. The satellites that now measure ice caps were first put into space to watch for incoming missiles. We are not the first to feel a future foreclosed. On a 1952 beach, in the afternoon sometime, my grandfather snapped this photo, suggesting a familiarity born of matrimonial love. In the photographs I have of my grandfather, he looks at the camera or just beyond, arms at his side, stolid. In groups, he remains a bit offset. With close family, he manages a proprietary embrace. As they grow, his children, my father and uncle, pull away from his arm. As he ages, my grandmother seeks out his hand and places her own on his shoulder. It is these photos I recall better than his physical presence. He was an intensely private, somewhat cold man who would spend the first hour or so of family gatherings alone in his study before emerging enveloped in the warm smell of pipe tobacco. I remember wanting to embrace that smell. I do not remember an embrace. For a time, he lived a great man's world of self-congratulations, documented by professional photographers. Board meetings, ribbon cuttings, gala dinners, chauffeured cars. Over the decades, his job evolved from testing corona loss on transmission lines to planning the city's future electrical projects. He assumed a doubling of power consumption every 6 to 8 years, no neutral forecast, really more of a growth model. The DWP produced the demand it projected. The municipal utility was financially independent from the city and kept prices low and use high. It sponsored appliance trade shows, financed air conditioning, and advertised that electric lifestyle on the pages of the LA Times. My grandfather's DWP reported $3 to $5 million of recurring revenue from increased power consumption year after year after year. LA's great acceleration outpaced most American cities, which in turn outpaced the rest of the world. From the standpoint of 2017, my grandfather's planning graphs look familiar. His demand curves foreshadow in pencil, on graph paper, in print, today's digital visualizations of environmental stress. Climate scientists have crunched the numbers. Earth systems turn sharply alarming around the middle of the 20th century. Stratigraphers, as you know, have proposed to call it the Anthropocene, a designation still awaiting approval by that august body that decides such things. Just as science has begun to notice how intimately entangled humans are with other beings, how we exist in and as a cloud of microorganisms, how our cells are built from bits and pieces of other species' DNA, we go and name an epoch after us. Symbolic start dates range from the invention of agriculture 13,000 years ago to 1784 and the design of the first modern steam engine to July 16th, 1945, the birth of the atomic age. The impulse to retroactively establish a starting line to pinpoint our fall from grace within a distinctly Western temporality is strong. So too is a techno-scientific aesthetic of glowing graphics, data viz, and a vectorized view of the world that we are not within but above. Science has only partially metabolized the contributions of feminist, indigenous, post-humanist critics. The technocratic masculinity governing my grandfather's world persists in data offering perspectiveless perspectives and projections not acknowledged to produce. Catherine Yusof writes, if we hold the Anthropocene to its epical claim of naming a major shift in geosocial relations, the threshold implies the destruction of everything that is tied to the Holocene, including late neoliberal subjectivity and its practices, forms of life tied to and lived through fossil fuels, humanism as an adequate system of thought, and capitalism as the defining plateau of operations. It implies the end of a world, my grandfather's world, that dominated as nature, economized as resource, or anonymized as infrastructure, a vast array of actors, organisms composed into coal, the tears of a crying child, the force and volume of a river, a woman's household labor, the switching stations that govern connections and disconnections in the grid. Lauren Berlant calls infrastructure that which binds us to the world in motion and keeps the world practically bound to itself. My grandfather would have been 99 the year my daughter was born. Instead, he died 18 years earlier when I was still in high school. The recorded milestones of my life, my parents and his, the birthday parties and Christmases, the parade of school portraits, the heading off to college, first relationship, first apartment, first job, these are so 20th century. I can and cannot place my daughter in these images. They hang in my mind without content, as the world in which they make any sense is being rearranged and on my watch. My daughter is growing animate but suspended. She is almost 8 years old now, her short life marked by climate milestones as much as developmental ones. She turned 5 in the warmest year on record, and then 6, and then 7. Her father and I buy her piano lessons and hold our breath. We talk to her about difficult things, climate change, capitalism, colonialism. Most of the time she's curious. Tell me why slavery happened, Mommy. Sometimes we overdo it. Her face crumples, she covers her ears. Don't tell me how bad the future will be. With some friends, she started an activism club in her second grade class. She tells me they march every Wednesday at recess. She has no desire for my organizing help. I don't know it will be bad, I tell my daughter and me. I don't know it will be bad at all. An emptiness where her future is concerned is preferable to the images of apocalypse that populate our collective environmental anxieties. I nurture and cultivate a space of blankness. It does not come easily to me. I find myself imagining her in college as I walk across some campus like this one, wondering if her love of poetry will survive another decade studying the features of informational texts. Then something shifts inside and I wake with a wrenching feeling in my gut. Who knows if that world will still exist? Who knows? Elders at climate action meetings choke up when they see her, and they tell me, blinking back tears, that they march, protest, blockade for her future. Such moments are both moving and alarming. I am moved because, to be honest, climate change became intimate for me only once I had this child, and such moments of intimacy shared with a stranger are rare. For the same reason, I'm also alarmed. The symbol of child as future, only ever inhabited by those who look like my child, has been mobilized for all sorts of repressions. That future is more about the reproduction of the present than the remaking of the world. The futures I can easily picture for her, the ones that most resemble my own past, I know they foreclose the futures of others, which is to say, they are no future at all. Sustain what? For whom? For how long? It's hard to let go of past futures in favor of a series of near-term horizons that disappear as soon as they come into focus. This afternoon, tomorrow, next week, this autumn. Her 520 plan won't help her build a permaculture commune, dig a well, shoot a gun. Even as I say the words, I know these cartoonish survival skills won't be the true arts of living on a damaged planet. Unmoored from service to a reified future, the near future becomes open, uncertain, contingent. The contingent future is not one humans face alone, of course. We never really have. Finding and cultivating new relations, responsive, open-ended, mutually composing relations, is at the heart of Donna Haraway's urgent writing on life in the precarious world. Rather than the Anthropocene, she has proposed to call our era the Thulacene. That's an earthbound word of her own playful invention, drawing on an ancient Greek term for underground and the name of a spider. The term acknowledges that human beings are with and of the earth, and the biotic and abiotic powers of this earth are the main story. Putting that recognition into practice requires making kin in ways that transcend family and species boundaries, that mean something other more than entities tied by ancestry and genealogy. Kinning can only begin when we acknowledge the world as a bio-geosocial composition. It proceeds only when the structures of reciprocal care and affection that Euro-American capitalist culture reserves for our children and parents are rewoven and made more connective. It learns from practices of queer family. It embraces bodies and beings beyond blood. It includes other critters as well as those things we call things and that form with us what we call the environment. We might more accurately and rapturously call them lines of connection that interweave our lives with human others, animal others, mineral others, technological others. Make kin, not babies, she tells us. Stephanie Lemonnier has begun to write of climate change as a crisis of intergenerational knowledge. She turns to the growing, paradox-laden genre of young adult cli-fi for clues as to how we, meaning our specific demographic, do and do not speculate with the young on what's to come. Written by professional class, mostly white adults, youth cli-fi novels are a means of communicating the skills we think our children will need for the world that we will leave them, but for which we've utterly failed to prepare beyond these forays into narrative fiction. These skills exist on the backside of the knowledge economy, the know-how of jury-rigging, scavenging, and making do. The most utopian of these novels do not reject technology or imagine a landscape of ruin. There is a lot of the world left to love. Maybe we don't have the heart to say just how bad we fear the future will be. We hope that the youth, despite our negligent preparation, will manage to craft the local solutions, local energy grids, and autonomous functioning systems we will need when the larger structures of society break down. In the space of fiction, people my age imagine our children will reverse engineer the infrastructure of my grandfather into something habitable, after all. This back to the future quality of climate change takes on a different character if we look beyond a generational horizon, if we see the crisis as not what's ahead, but as something that arrived long ago, as something that arrived with us. Indigenous critics of the Anthropocene note that the processes of forced displacement, land loss, and mass species extinction that settler cultures are just beginning to worry about have been experienced by colonized peoples for over 5 centuries. Another proposed Anthropocene start date, the landing of Christopher Columbus on what he called San Salvador, a name betraying his own desperation and near failure to survive. In this story, climate change is the result of colonialism's structural violence, not merely the unintended byproduct of innocently burning fossil fuels. A vast body of indigenous ecological knowledge has persisted, grown, and been carried across generations, despite colonization's forced displacements and mass environmental destruction. The world that now exists, the one that settler cultures so fear losing, is someone else's apocalypse, survived. And what did I learn from my grandfather? These poses come from 3 collections: an album of family snapshots, an archive of corporate photographs, and a catalog of American paintings. They are images of being fruitful and multiplying, of settling the Wild West, of making your way in the world, of conquering Mother Nature, of laying a solid foundation, of engineering the future. In that way, they are all fragments of the same picture. They function as unpainted sequels to Westward the Course of Empire makes its way. My grandfather's generation of engineers rode the long tail of that wagon train full of rugged men and their wives to populate a landscape so recently, but not quite completely, dispossessed. Along the path of old settlement trails, they built telephone poles, national highways, transmission lines. My grandfather spent his life with these lines, testing and tending them to deliver the power they promised. Over the decades, he helped them carry not just Colorado River hydropower, but coal-fired electricity from the Mojave and Navajo generating stations. By 1967, LA's air quality had prompted him to end the use of coal in the DWP steam plants, to much fanfare and many awards, one of which you just saw. The air in Nevada and Arizona was not his concern. The Mojave generating station ran on a slurry of pulverized coal and groundwater shipped through a 273-mile pipeline from Peabody Energy's Black Mesa mine. As early as 1971, the plant's neighbors reported dusting coal ash off their cars with brooms. The Navajo generating station on tribal land, but like the coal mine, not tribally owned, is the largest and dirtiest power plant in the West. Every day, it pumps 44,000 tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, along with sulfur and particulate matter. Cancer rates have doubled on the reservation since the plant came online in 1976. The Mojave plant closed 12 years ago after a coalition of Navajo and Hopi convinced the tribe to not allow further depletion of the aqueduct to make coal slurry. Obama-era EPA rules prompted the company to plan shutdown of the Navajo generating station in 2019. With it will vanish about 800 jobs on the reservation where the unemployment rate hovers around 45%. The Black Mesa Coalition, which has been working for a just transition since Mojave closed, but they describe the Navajo leadership as fossil fuel dependent. Perhaps hoping his commitment to coal outweighs his hatred of Indians, the Navajo tribal chairman has asked Donald Trump to intervene and keep the plant open. Though his work was instrumental to these coal projects, my grandfather's real love was nuclear. At Stanford, he asked if the physics department, not engineering, might accept his dissertation. He had a lifelong contempt for people who just didn't understand the science. For a decade, he pursued an ambitious plan to create what he called, quote, reserve centers close to load centers to establish higher reliability without contributing to smog, unquote. He envisioned a series of 30 nuclear power plants on the Pacific coast by the year 2000, stretching from Morro Bay to Mexico. They were to be cooled by the sea. Only 3 commercial nuclear power plants were ever built in California. Today, 1 remains in operation. The rest were abandoned due to political pressure or regulatory changes in the wake of 3 Mile Island. My grandfather attended the ribbon cutting of the San Onofre nuclear generating station, since 2012 closed due to radiation leaks and other safety violations. As general manager, he was forced to shelve plans to build a power plant in Malibu's Coral Canyon. He couldn't will this particular opposition movement away. In 1976, the state passed a construction moratorium until the issue of radioactive waste disposal could be resolved. The moratorium remained in place for over 40 years. And in 1991, the year my grandfather died, the forgotten 98-acre site began a slow slide toward the sea. The fight over Coral Canyon must have been hard on my grandfather, though he wouldn't let on. He'd been the force behind the project all along and eventually had to pull the plug. Every other infrastructure project he'd work on had succeeded. A bunch of entertainers and hippies had defeated this one. He hated playing politics and associated opposition with ignorance. Of course, the politics of his own expertise and its limits were not visible as such. He had a heart attack and recovered, but work wasn't the same after that. He retired early at 61, anticipating a second heart attack that never came. Brooding, aloof, depressed, he lived another 19 years. The world and his family changed around him in many ways. In other ways, it didn't change enough. His religion, always vaguely apocalyptic, became obsessed with the end times. The signs may have been there, but not where he was looking. My grandfather passed away 1 year after the first intergovernmental report established that human activities were warming the planet. He was too far gone to notice, but I was both old enough and young enough to care. The next year was the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, and tellingly, the 500th anniversary of Columbus's first colonial voyage. At the summit, Chile proposed the notion of ecological debt. The word captures how the prosperity and development of the global north was financed by hundreds of years of extraction, deforestation, land theft, and pollution in the global south. The idea helped to reframe the debate surrounding poor countries' cash debts to the World Bank and the IMF and set the stage for the alter-globalization movements of the 1990s and early 2000s, about the time I became more actively involved in politics. It resurfaced a few years later in the debate about how to fairly, justly distribute sharp emissions cuts. In 2008, climate scientist James Hansen drafted a letter outlining in detail what he called the carbon debt of each industrialized nation, calculated as its percentage of all industrially released carbon dioxide since 1750. The United States finishes well in front of the pack, of course, with over 27% of this total. At the Copenhagen Climate Summit the following year, 6 months after my daughter's birth, a coalition of least developed nations used the idea, which didn't, of course, originate with Hansen alone, to propose reparations in the form of development and adaptation funding to the countries who had contributed the least to global warming but were already experiencing the biggest impacts. The Cochabamba Declaration, issued the following year, called the North's repayment of climate debt, quote, the basis for a just, effective, and scientific solution for climate change. According to Hansen's figures, the estimated climate debt of the United States is almost $10 trillion. A number like that is hard to understand. Put another way, Obama's famous $3 billion contribution to the Green Climate Fund would need to be repeated annually for 3,000 years to settle this debt, even assuming no further interest accrued. Trump has, of course, proposed to eliminate these payments. The scale of ecological debt, a term even more encompassing than climate debt, defies all attempts at accounting it. How to place a value on the disappearance of a species, how to put a price on an entire way of life. Can it be calculated both in the past and in a future tense? Would doing so be an act of responsibility or the definition of its limit? Placed in the wider scale of colonialism, it becomes clear that the ecological debt owed by the global north and its settler colonies vastly exceeds the value of all unpaid loans anywhere in the world. Fred Moten and Stefano Harvey say that debt that cannot be repaid must be activated as a principle of social life. In other words, what do I owe on behalf of my grandfather? What will my daughter owe for me? From opposite shores of that oceanic expanse we call the 20th century, they will never see each other's faces, but mere images, they are all the same. For all the popularity of Ancestry.com, we do not live in a genealogical society. By that, I mean a society of social responsibilities and personal constraints based on expanded kinships and inheritances. Nor are we fully autological subjects, free, self-authoring individuals operating in a rational arena of contractual capitalist democracy. Elizabeth Pavanelli has proposed these two as dialectically related discourses, practices, and fantasies that intersect and conflict in our intimate and political lives. Kinship contemplates discourses of autological subjectivity, but our own biological children may not. These offspring project the biological self past the limits of the lifetime. The present persists in the future. We speak of inheritances passed down to children, but prefer to ignore the debts. But a genealogical society, on the other hand, opens to a wider time frame, both past and future, and a web of relationships that do not emphasize a single patriarch's legacy so much as our kinship intersections. We must take seriously and make intimate what we've learned about our precarious non-human and human kin. What environmental responsibilities and personal constraints do I experience if I admit as an uncle or cousin the Toluca or Van Nuys receiving stations? The steady power they pulse through the San Fernando Valley shaped my childhood habits, and in turn the development of mind, muscle, and bone. My grandfather's attention to their care and construction shaped his relationship with my father, and in turn his with me. Any just and sustainable future must move through, not retreat from, the full burden, physical, environmental, emotional, of this carbon-heavy infrastructure. The DWP a few years ago signed an agreement to go coal-free by 2025. Last year, it sold its share in the Navajo generating station, a move that reduced by a quarter its reliance on coal. But the lines of connection and the responsibilities they imply are not so easily severed. Selling off, shutting down, divesting now with nothing else in place reinscribes the colonial economies already in force, the dispossession that's already taken place. If we think of infrastructure not just as something that forms our life, but that binds us together with others as a new form of life, the relationship changes. We can feel our way down electric lines of connection. We find our queer transhuman kin. Perhaps we make a commitment to repair the irreparable, to find ways of living with a collective damage and brokenness that does not make worse its unequal distribution, that cares, that tends, that recognizing that healing is not fully possible. Fred Moten continues to write on debt. I'm going to have to look this one up. Debt is mutual, he writes. Climate debt even more. Like current on an old transmission line, credit runs only one way, but debt runs in every direction, scatters, escapes, seeks refuge. The debtor seeks refuge among other debtors, acquires debt from them, offers debt to them. The place of refuge is the place to which you can only owe more and more because there is no creditor, no payment possible. Wendy Brown calls justice the practice of responsible relations between generations. But my genealogy is also electric. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was incredible. Really, just unbelievably thoughtful, provocative, and really exciting. Such an achievement. So thank you so much for sharing that with us.
That's very generous. I
wanted to begin by begin sort of near where you ended. You spoke of filiation, genealogy, and kinship. And when we had a chance to meet briefly before the performance, and we spoke a little bit about the kind of genealogy of this project. I'm thinking both not only about kinship of bodies, but also scholarly interlocutors for this work. One of the things I find really remarkable about this lecture is the way it sort of positioned scholars, artists, thinkers of incredibly disparate fields in dialogue with one another and in dialogue with you. There's a real sense of kind of intimacy with research itself and with scholarship. I was reminded of my friend Che Gossett, who sometimes says in her bio that they're in an open relationship with academia and in an intimate relationship with ideas. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about how you as an artist and as a thinker navigate the complex genealogies of this work. Maybe you could, I mean, as an artist myself, I'm especially interested in sort of how you developed a form and a model that could enable you to perform the complexity that you evoke and describe, but while also allowing the work itself to function as a very open proposal, and that openness, I think, exists in the space between you as a performer and the images that we see. I was struck by the fact that the performance is not descriptive of the video, but instead we kind of move in and out. We focus on you, and then we move away. And similarly, formally within the work itself, there's this. Sorry, I'm going to talk a little bit, and then I'll get to the question.
I just did a lot of talking.
You just did a lot of talking. I know. I feel I should relieve you. It's my responsibility to give you a break for a little while. But I was struck by so there's this gesture when you're sifting through archival photographs where we move from from out of focus into focus. The photographs clarify, and that initial space in which the images are not in focus is actually really kind of frightening. Like there's something about it that is almost scary in its indistinctness. And one of the really powerful gestures in the work is that we move into that clarity. Images kind of slip by, and then we move away again. That one of the tools that we have as artists, or one of the metaphors that's often used to describe the way that we think and construct images is that we talk about this relationship between figure and ground. And I was thinking a lot about how both how you sort of model conventional and unconventional pictorial relationships in the images, but also in our relationship between you as a performer, you as a figure, in the context of this of the visual space that you create, and the kind of the broader space that is actually the room and the stage and the desk and the images and you. So I guess I'm thinking about how all of this, maybe to introduce another term that spans that possesses both literary and art historical implications. I'm also thinking a little bit about perspective and the way in which this work inhabits a space that is outside and sort of transcendent of, and nonetheless deeply embedded within a network of ideas. Have you got your breath yet?
That's a lot to respond to.
It's a lot to respond to. So maybe we can start by going back to where I began and thinking a little bit and talking a little bit about the genealogy of your practice as an artist, the kind of artists and thinkers who have made possible the way of working that that you perform today.
Sure. I mean, I should begin by saying that this project isn't new, but it's been pursued in a very haphazard and episodic way over vacations, going back home, seeing my family, having a conversation, calling the DWP and going to their archive, knowing that I was assembling something out of a set of fragments that it would begin to fall in place once those fragments had been left adjacent to each other and allowed to sift around a little bit. So during that long period of gestation, since we're using so many reproductive metaphors, there were a few things that I have found very moving. I mean, I'm really interested in the sort of newer experiments with live narrated documentary film, which I think managed to address the sort of problematics of the authoritative voice of documentary through this performance and reperformance of trying to grapple with the meaning of the image. So even if the text remains relatively fixed, the slippage right between the image and the word that inevitably happens because you take a breath in one place or another, it changes, right? And it also invites, I think, a kind of intimate engagement and viewership with the people watching the piece in a way that sort of cinematic modes of viewership do not. So, I've seen a few different versions of different people's notions of performed documentary that have both been all been very instrumental to me. I also, a friend put on an affect studies symposium, and I remember there were a lot of really wonderful things. I took exhaustive notes, but the moment that most stuck with me was when very esteemed scholars were talking about their relation to the materiality of knowledge, and we're talking about how when they're working on a project, they assemble shrines or collections of books, artifacts, texts, and other objects and that they allow that to sort of live in the corner of their workspace for a while. And I was struck by the relationship of that to a kind of studio, or a studio artist's process of creation of sketches and juxtaposition of work in a kind of collage. And it opened up for me the possibility of further hybridizing those modes in a single piece. And I think that that provided a lot of the genesis for the slippage of voice between storytelling and analysis that I was trying to achieve here, and then also the loose rhythm of vocal and voice and text, right? Because when you're performing, it's both, right? And image. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm thinking also about just the way in which performance makes it sort of creates a space within which risk can re-enter the interaction of ideas, so that so often it seems as though we're interested in creating opportunities for ideas to kind of ping in some kind of intellectual arena, like a symposium or a conference. But often it can be hard to retain that sense that that there are a kind of range of options, a range of possibilities, a range of trajectories, intellectual trajectories, and also a range of ways of thinking about and assembling a set of stakes. And there's something about a performer, particularly in this work, because of the incredible activity of memory and timing, and it was a really virtuosic presentation.
Almost.
It really, really incredible. And even I think that because there is much about memory and forgetting with relation to this work in particular that I would love to talk more about, because I actually think that what happens when one creates an opportunity to not remember is that not only do we have it, not only do we create a kind of space of risk where all of a sudden something else can happen, but also it creates a possibility for a new way of thinking about the relationship between, to speak really crudely, the relationship between the past or the archive and the future. One of the moments that I found most beautiful and most evocative in the script, when I had a chance to encounter it earlier, was your discussion of the challenge of creating, of inviting new ways of thinking about the future that do not simply rehearse and reproduce existing kind of intellectual grooves. And from my perspective, what happens is when the piece involves this kind of activity of memory and remembering, forgetting and remembering, is that it creates an opportunity to sort of escape those grooves, or at least that's what is exciting to me. And so it's actually watching you remember is very powerful. I was thinking a little bit of a quote that I sometimes mention with my students. Wittgenstein once wrote that one of the kind of curious things about memory and forgetting is that you can't forget at will. That the activity of trying to forget always sort of brings to mind the very object of forgetting. And there's something about that tension, that dialectic, that seems really critical to an animating of this work, where on the one hand you're sort of haunted by relationship to genealogy, relationship to your kind of specific kin, your family, these men and women who look like you or who look like your daughter, and at the same time are opening up a set of opportunities for thinking or pointing us to the necessity of understanding that what we need in the future are new solutions, recognizing your family's implication in a whole set of challenges. I think I've always been interested in the ways in which in the ways in which working with the archive often feels it's utopian in the sense that it's kind of awaiting its future use. It's awaiting its destination, which can only be fully understood or fully used at some time in the future. And you mentioned when we spoke earlier that your family has an extraordinary archive of photographs and materials. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the activity of sifting through those materials, how you make decisions about how to make use of this work, and I wonder if you could also talk about your relationship with other archival sources.
Mm-hmm. So I love what you just said about the act of moving through the archive is a future-looking proposition because it's about reanimating and placing in new contexts these images and words so that they might speak something else other than the context in which they were placed in that archive. And I think one of the things that has been interesting for me looking at or listening to a lot of the presentations so far is that many of us are engaged in this act of archival revisionist, like looking for possible other threads of this weight of history. I think that there was this quote earlier, says this sort of like not to be a victim of history, right? But to rather be in a position to amplify, to select, to recompose in a future tense way. Mm-hmm. And I think that this is a gesture at doing that I don't yet know like where it lands. And I think that that's very important, that section where I talk about the kind of ad hoc nature of this vision of the near future, that we can't come up with grand plans for climate change because we simply don't know, and that to do so is to resurrect, reconstruct, recapitulate the same logics of master planning, right, and expansion that got us into this condition. So it's attempting a kind of humility in relation to its source materials that is not. I mean, I find the word like liberating my family from its own past, but that's so presumptuous, right? It's more like playing with it and experimenting, improvising. So in terms of specific image selection process, I mean, I was very struck when I was looking through the archive at how I was interested in the sort of mechanics of the non-DSLR camera, where the subject of the picture is always off to the side, right? That you never quite get there. It's impossible to quite make a perfect framing
because you don't have the reflexive mirror. Exactly.
Right, and that I think served as a framing device, or for a lot of my thinking about the project. It's like we're already looking at this thing through a crude approximation of what people saw at the time, and so let's just nudge that frame over a little bit more and imagine what might have been in that picture, right, had it not been framed in that particular way or accomplished with that particular technology. Yeah.
Thank you. Do we have time? Should I continue, or should I create some time for questions?
Maybe we should have questions.
Yeah, we should have questions.
A couple questions.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Are there 2 or 3 questions? Because if not, I have a zillion more questions. So.
Jessica. Yeah. Hey, and there's a mic. Hi. Thank you so much for that performance lecture. I think it's connecting in many ways with some of the more performative dimensions of earlier lectures in this conference that I've really enjoyed as a kind of intervention in the delivery of knowledge and authority and so on. I have been struck across the whole conference by the way in which the scholars who Christopher and Rebecca have brought together are participating in the creation of maybe a kind of a larger or longer genealogy of proto-ecological ancestors, colonial ancestors, indigenous ancestors, various kinds of engagements with ancestors across the conference. And when you characterized your grandfather as a disciplinarian, I started to wonder about the way in which maybe art history is the disciplinarian grandfather still sort of present in the room, and the ancestor or the part of the genealogy that we're all, many of us have a kind of family baggage, right, coming from the discipline. And so one of the things that I was struck by in your talk is the way in which you very generously sort of moved out of a position of either, either needing to sort of deny one's unsavory ancestors or claiming them necessarily as the sort of essential grounds from which you yourself identify and speak from and so on. So a kind of space where one is grappling with ancestors without needing to either celebrate or sort of, separate from. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit, as someone, of course, I know that you're not necessarily speaking from art history, but you're speaking in the context of a kind of conference devoted to the development of an eco-art history, whether you had any thoughts about this sort of larger situation of dealing with one's disciplinary ancestor or disciplinarian context. Did that make any sense?
I can try to answer that. I mean, my disciplinary context is not art history, and so I think that I have been given a kind of wider latitude to, assemble these kinds of unusual interlocutors in the work, and yet the weight of image making, right, bears its own history on you. And I'm very interested in how art history ends up, or the history of image making in the West ends up getting taken up by people who are not overtly skilled or schooled in either image making or in art history. So those, the images of, standing at the overlook, right, and, stand on top of the mountain, right, how aligned those are with images of westward expansion. So those are ancestors that I think are really useful to acknowledge in those practices, because it makes less innocent those images, and it allows you to connect with a very well-developed critique in art history about the function of those images and the function of kind of the pictorial and the empty, the wilderness. So I've found art history to open up those kinds of avenues for me and my work, but I don't feel the need to make a contribution to that discipline. I think the thing that I feel dogged by disciplinarily is the idea of like the bounded object, like the thing that will stand for itself, right, outside of your having to represent it. That's the disciplinary baggage of sort of studio art education in the period of time that I went through undergraduate and graduate school, that having to speak for your work, right, is a terrible thing. And so this is just like, you know what, I'm going to speak for the work. The work is the speaking for the work. And so there's an owning of the criticism through its refutation, or the incorporation of that, taking it to its logical extreme. I'm not sure if that precisely answered your question.
Are there any other questions for Sarah?
Thank you so much for that contribution. I was wondering, I was really struck by kind of this precarious relationship with child rearing that you spoke about throughout, and I was wondering if you could just say a little bit more about how you distilled what I'm sure are a number of paradoxical experiences raising your daughter into what you presented today.
How I distilled them? Yeah.
Yes, and by distilled I mean kind of, to me I saw a really coherent arc that that grappled with the impossibility of trying to sort of like, again, respect lineages and heritages and teach what you've been taught while also disrupting it and and sort of like dealing with the rupture of being a parent in the Anthropocene or in the apocalypse.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I was just wondering how you sort of like how you sort of picked which moments you did and what that process looked like for you.
So I've been, like I said earlier, I've been working on this for quite a while, so it's actually encompassed a large arc of my parenting. Since my daughter is not quite 8, I've been thinking about this in one form or another for about 2.5 years. I think some of the moments that end up being the most poignant are actually quite recent and are things that are not yet settled for me. And that is where the notion of improvisation comes in as a compositional strategy, even though what you see at any given iteration is very much composed. So there's the image of the beach where she sticks her face in front of the camera. I was like irritated that she did that like 2 weeks ago when we were on Cape Cod. And then I was like, no, actually that intrusion is absolutely perfect. I think the distillation happens in part through the process of unintentional forgetting, and you see what sticks and what remains resonant and seems more important over time. And those things might not be the same in any given iteration of the writing.
Do we have a little more time, or? No. No, we do not.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much, Tara. That was really, really incredible. So
All right.
thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.